My wife's father mocked me and fired me in front of everyone. Even she laughed, as if my pain were entertainment, as if my pride, shattered before dozens of eyes and laughter, was something small, easy to bear. But in that moment, with the weight of her gaze that mixed contempt and relief, I understood what had been happening for a long time and I had refused to see. I was no longer loved. And worse, I was no longer respected. I was just a convenient prop, a disposable piece in the game of appearances of that family that never truly accepted me. I rose from my chair, my voice choked in my throat, like someone swallowing blood to keep from spitting out anger. I said nothing. Not a word. I left the company, I left her life. And I didn't look back. I wasn't going to beg for love, not after having given everything and received in response a muffled chuckle from the one who once promised to love me no matter the circumstances. In the days that followed, her silence was even crueler than that public moment of humiliation. No message. No call. No explanation. It was as if my departure had been a relief. As if the weight of my presence had been, for her, the greatest burden of her life. She went on with her life as if nothing had happened. She was seen at parties, smiling, next to a man who clearly existed before my dismissal. The betrayal didn't begin the same day I left, it was just revealed there, in front of everyone. She let me lose everything, to have the last laugh. And that laugh was what woke me up. Because I had never been weak. I was just blind. I spent entire nights reliving that scene. The laughter. The look. The coldness. And the sound of her voice saying, "You always take everything too seriously." As if my love were an exaggeration. As if my effort to be part of her family were a nuisance. As if I, because I didn't share the same powerful surname, was never worthy of respect. But it wasn't her family I wanted to win over, it was her. I fought for her, for our love, while she laughed behind my back. While I believed I was building a future, she was already preparing the end. And it was there, between a cold forkful of silence and the certainty of my insignificance to her, that something inside me changed. The pain became a driving force. Love transformed into drive. And everything I carried in my chest as defeat became fuel to start over. But this time, without her. I vanished. I disappeared. I turned off all the lights, silenced all the access points. No one knew where I was, what I was doing, what I was planning. And while she continued to mock, as if she'd won a war that never existed, I silently built what she would one day realize she'd lost. Because I was never weak. I was never small. I was love, presence, truth. And she thought she could mock that. She thought true love was something found around every corner, as if it were replaceable, as if my surrender were just another one. But time, oh, time has a curious way of teaching the value of things. And when the laughter ends, the echo of emptiness becomes deafening. It took a while. But the day arrived. And it was with a calm, peaceful heart, without a trace of hatred, that I picked up the phone. I called the number I'd once hoped would call me to apologize. Her father's voice answered, surprised. I simply said, "Call your daughter and turn on the TV immediately." And I hung up. Without anger. Without urgency. Just with the peace of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. On the other end, I know she ran, perhaps mockingly, thinking it was just another scene. Perhaps still believing it was all a show. But when the screen lit up, and my face appeared, no longer haggard, no longer weak, but serene, firm, victorious, she finally understood. She saw who was before her. And for the first time in a long time, she found herself in silence. Because there was nothing more she could say. There, live, while everyone watched the interview with the city's new millionaire, while I told her about my new journey, my new life, and the peaceful love that now accompanied me, the laughter died in her throat. Because it wasn't about money, never was. It was about value. And what she threw away out of pride, another woman gently took and made blossom. I didn't need to scream, I didn't need to seek revenge. I just moved on. While she stood there, watching, with the teary eyes of someone who knew she'd lost everything. Because you can replace a partner, you can find another body by your side, but you never rebuild broken respect. And she broke mine. I learned, weeks later, that she tried to talk to me. Tried to get closer. Tried to justify herself with arguments that no longer held any weight. And for the first time, I heard her voice and felt no pain. I felt only distance. And she said, I forgive you. Because those who free themselves from the past don't harbor hatred. But they also don't go back. The forgiveness wasn't for her, it was for me. To end that cycle without leaving open wounds. But I never opened the door again. And she knew it immediately. Her voice faltered, silence took over, and then she hung up. Time passed. And with it, true love arrived. It arrived without fanfare, without dispute, without needing to prove anything. Calm eyes, sincere hands, words that needed no stage. With her, I didn't need to shout my worth. She saw it in the silence. She understood in my gaze. And that was the greatest victory I could have. Because while the woman who betrayed me spent her life trying to rediscover that sparkle she once saw in my eyes, I had already found another home. Another embrace. Another love. I understand she's alone now. That she goes out with friends, that she smiles, but that she comes home and sleeps embraced by memories. They say she's changed, that she's more introspective, that she stares into the void as if waiting for something that won't return. That she asks about me sometimes, that she watches my interviews, that she keeps an old photo of us in a drawer in her room. But none of that matters anymore. Time doesn't come back. Respect, when you go, you take love with you. And now, all that's left are memories. Good and bad. But all distant. She had it all. And she lost it through arrogance. And that's the pain no one sees, but that consumes her from within. Because when she looks in the mirror, she doesn't just see her face. She sees what could have been. She sees the man who truly loved her and who is now happy with someone else. She sees the love she threw away. And she knows that, no matter how much time passes, no matter how many new faces and bodies she encounters, she will never find that look again. The look of someone who, even fallen, would choose her again. And who, now standing, will never turn back. But what happened that day I hung up the phone and asked her to turn on the TV? What was broadcast that silently turned her world upside down? What exactly did she see that shattered her smile and made her face, for the first time, the weight of loss? And more than that, did she ever understand what she truly lost? Or was her regret too late? Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize cheating, we expose it. All the stories you hear are fictional, but the emotions are real. Our goal is clear, to show how betrayal destroys lives, breaks trust and leaves deep scars. Get ready. What you're about to hear is more than a story. It's a reality check. Press play, and feel it. His name was Daniel. He was 34 years old and carried on his shoulders not only the responsibility of a home, but also the pride of having built every part of his life with effort and dignity. He was a man of firm presence and restrained words, the kind who prefers to show love through silent actions rather than empty declarations. He came from a simple family, where work was celebrated more than material achievements and where values like loyalty, gratitude, and respect were not discussed, they were lived. Daniel was not perfect, but he was whole. And it was with this whole heart that he gave himself to the woman who changed his life. Her name was Isabel. Young, radiant, the only daughter of an influential and imposing businessman. She grew up in a home where silverware said more about people than their life stories, where every step was taken under the watchful eye of a controlling father and an elegant, distant mother. Isabel, behind her charismatic smile and engaging speech, was a woman searching for belonging. As confident as she appeared, she carried a subtle anxiety to be accepted as something other than the daughter of. She was accustomed to being desired, admired, surrounded by suitors who saw her as a trophy. Daniel was the opposite of all this. He didn't want to show off, didn't want to compete, didn't want to impress, he simply saw who she truly was, and treated her with tenderness, simplicity, and a calm that dismantled any pretense. That was what attracted her. The contrast. The raw truth of someone who didn't need to prove her worth because it simply existed within her. The beginning was beautiful. They met at an informal gathering of mutual friends. She wore a blue dress that effortlessly made her presence felt, and he wore a simple shirt and a curious look. They talked all night, not about travel or business, but about small, even banal things, their taste for strong coffee, their habit of walking aimlessly to think, how much they both loved rainy Sundays. The connection wasn't quick like a spark, but slow and enveloping, like a fire growing with the right wind. Over time, she began visiting his places, meeting his friends, listening to stories of her childhood in ordinary neighborhoods. He, in turn, learned to walk in silence through her family's formal dinners, where every sentence was measured like a speech and every smile seemed calculated. Despite their worldly differences, the two decided to persevere. Love, when it exists, has the uncanny ability to turn obstacles into stepping stones. Daniel made a point of respecting her timetable, accepting her background and her pace. Isabel, on the other hand, tried to learn to live with less spotlight and more truth. It wasn't always easy. Her father never hid his contempt for that man who, according to him, had nothing to offer but good intentions. Her mother, discreet, simply followed protocol, greeting Daniel with a polite smile, but never truly allowing him to feel part of it. Even so, he never complained. With every uncomfortable dinner, with every sidelong glance, he simply looked at Isabel, and that was enough. Over time, the big decisions came. They married in a low-key ceremony, more because of Daniel's wishes than hers. Isabel had always dreamed of something bigger, something worthy of her upbringing, but she gave in. She said it was love that mattered, and at the time, she truly believed that. They moved into an elegant, but not overly so, apartment. She wanted to decorate everything, choose every piece of furniture, and he simply watched, enchanted by her enthusiasm for making the place a home. In the first few months, the two seemed like a movie couple. There was complicity, desire, and plans. He would wake up early and leave a note on the coffee maker, she would prepare dinner when he arrived late. Small gestures, small niceties that created a meaningful daily life. Daniel grew professionally within her family's company. He started as a discreet manager, responsible for areas no one else wanted to touch. He accepted with humility, as he always did. Soon, he earned respect. Not by flattery, not by imposing himself, but by the quiet competence that always accompanied him. He solved problems. He listened to employees. He kept the wheels turning. He earned the trust of many, except for his father-in-law, who always watched his every move with suspicion. Isabel begged him to let it go. "That's just how my father is," she said, almost as if pleading for eternal patience. And Daniel let it go. Not out of fear, but for her. The routine continued, as it does for any couple trying. There were trips, good times, and a few seemingly ordinary fights. Sometimes she was irritated by his reserved manner, by the fact that he didn't react to provocations. "You never assert yourself," she would say, as if poking at a wound that doesn't even exist yet. He would smile sideways, unsure how to react. Other times, he would be the one to remain silent for days after small arguments, not out of pride, but because he preferred to think before speaking. The silences began to grow. But there was always reconciliation. There was always that kiss at the end of the day that seemed to say, "We're still here." As the years passed, Elizabeth began to change subtly. She was no longer as interested in simple conversations. The sparkle in her eyes she'd had when he spoke of his small achievements now seemed replaced by distraction. Affectionate gestures became rarer. Daniel understood, but said nothing. He attributed it all to the stress of everyday life, the natural fatigue of dealing with pressure from all sides. But something in her gaze was no longer the same. Something in her touch seemed rehearsed. He tried to keep the connection alive, with surprise trips, gifts, bedside conversations, but he felt like he was trying to hold sand between his fingers. Little by little, she began to be more absent. Late meetings, last-minute events, quick trips without warning. Daniel remained patient, believing it was all part of a difficult phase. He wasn't naive, he just loved her enough to believe that, with time and effort, everything would fall into place. He remembered how it all began, how she looked at him on their first dates, and he clung to that memory like a castaway clinging to the last lifeline. When he saw her smiling at others, he longed for that smile back. When he saw her tired, he wanted to care for her. When he felt distant, he wanted to pull her back. But what do you do when someone no longer wants to be pulled? Still, he didn't give up. One rainy night, he prepared a special dinner, played the music they'd danced to when they first started dating, and waited for her with a simple gift, a photo album of the two of them, filled with old notes and letters he'd saved. She arrived late, wet, and upon seeing it all, she simply said she was tired, that they'd talked too much that day, and that she needed a shower. She didn't open the album. She didn't read the notes. She didn't dance. Daniel gathered everything in silence, his heart heavy, but still willing to try. Because that's what he did, he tried. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple. Smiling photos on social media, events where they arrived hand in hand, family dinners where everyone pretended everything was harmonious. But inside, the house was already cracking. Not for lack of love from Daniel, but for something he couldn't yet name. It was a present absence. It was the feeling of sharing a bed with a stranger who was once his home. It was looking to the side and no longer recognizing the soul behind the face. Still, he kept going. Because there was love. Because he believed. Because he'd rather suffer trying than give up too soon. Until the day everything changed. Until the day her laughter, echoing in the company hallway, cut him deeper than any goodbye. But that day was yet to come. The days piled up like pages in a book Daniel could no longer write. He would wake up, get dressed, go to work, and return home to a silence that no longer bothered him as before, but became a part of him, like an echo that could no longer be fought, only accepted. The love endured, but he no longer felt reciprocated. Isabel had become increasingly absent, though she was still there. There were no scandalous fights or open arguments, but rather a slow erosion, a silent deterioration made up of unsaid gestures, swallowed words, and averted glances. She still slept beside him, but she seemed miles away, like someone living in another dimension, even though they shared the same roof. She was a phantom presence, and he was beginning to realize that love alone no longer sustained what they had built. At the company, the looks had also changed. Daniel noticed small gestures, less warm greetings, doors that once opened and now seemed to close slowly, conversations that ceased as he approached. He wasn't paranoid, never had been, but there was a strange energy circulating in the hallways, as if something were about to happen. His father-in-law, who had never been an admirer, began treating him with a cordiality too artificial to ignore. It was as if everyone knew something he didn't. And even Isabel, when she mentioned work, made brief, impersonal comments, as if he were just another employee. It hurt. He, who had worked so hard to belong, now found himself on the margins, slowly being pushed out by invisible hands. But still, he insisted on not seeing what was forming before his eyes. At home, things continued to fall apart inside. Isabel no longer greeted him with a light kiss like before, and dinners together became rare. She went out frequently to networking events, after-hours meetings, and catch-ups with old childhood friends. When he asked if she needed company, she responded matter-of-factly that it would be a quick one, just work. And he believed her. Not out of naivete, but out of faith. Because, despite everything, he still wanted to believe she was the same woman who had once loved him. But the truth is, Isabel no longer looked at him the way she used to. When they were in the same room, she watched him as if trying to find something she'd lost, not as if recognizing what she still had. Their hands no longer touched, their eyes no longer sought each other, and even the silences were no longer comfortable. They were there, side by side, but a chasm grew between them, invisible and increasingly insurmountable. One random night, Daniel arrived home early from work, intending to surprise her. He bought flowers, chose her favorite wine, and prepared a simple dinner. He waited in the living room, anxious, his heart light as he tried, once again, to rekindle something. The hours passed. The clock struck 10, then 11. Isabel wasn't answering her cell phone. When she finally walked in the door, exhausted and visibly uncomfortable to see him awake, she told him she'd lost track of time, that it was just a business dinner. Daniel tried to smile, to hand her the flowers, but she only muttered a hurried thank you and went straight to her room. He stood there, bouquet in hand and cold plate on the table, staring into the emptiness of an attempt that no longer made sense. It was at that moment that he began to look more closely. He wasn't looking for proof, he didn't want proof. He just wanted to understand if there was still something there. He began to notice the different perfumes, the rehearsed smiles on the phone, the increasingly poorly worded apologies. He began to lose sleep, waking up in the middle of the night and staring at the ceiling for hours, wondering where, exactly, they had gotten lost. There were no fights, no shouting, just a growing emptiness. And it was into this emptiness that he began to fall. One afternoon, after leaving work early, he decided to stop by the coffee shop where she usually went after meetings. He parked across the street, with no plans, driven only by a restlessness he could no longer suppress. He observed the facade, the coming and going of people, and then he saw Isabel. She wasn't alone. Sitting across from a man, she was smiling differently. It was a light, intimate smile, the kind Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. The man touched her hand across the table. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away either. They seemed too comfortable with each other. Daniel stood there, motionless, unable to think, his eyes fixed on that scene that tore him apart. It wasn't just the touch or the smile. It was the fact that she seemed alive. Alive in a way she no longer was with him. He didn't confront her. Not that day. He returned home, driving without knowing where he was going, his hands trembling and his heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. When he arrived, he left the car in the garage and went upstairs without making a sound. He sat on the couch and stared at the walls. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply felt the weight of the end. It was as if he had been pulled from a dream and thrown into a cold reality, where love had been replaced by convenience, and complicity by lies. For days, he avoided Isabel. He pretended to sleep when she arrived, averted his eyes during conversations, and gave short answers. Inside him, something was building, not hatred, but a decision. He knew he had to leave. Not out of pride, but for survival. Because loving someone who no longer chooses you is a slow form of death. The betrayal was confirmed on a random morning, with the sun too high for the pain it carried. Daniel had left her phone charging in the living room, as he sometimes did. A notification flashed. He hadn't intended to see it. But he did. And then he saw another. And another. Messages exchanged with that same man. Intimate phrases, codes that didn't require interpretation. It was love. It was desire. It was everything he hadn't received in months. And in that moment, there was no doubt. There were no more assumptions. There was proof. And yet, the pain didn't come from the messages. It came from the certainty that she no longer loved him, and that, perhaps, she hadn't loved him for a long time. He didn't confront her that day. Instead, he got up early, put on an outfit he liked, and left for work as usual. But inside, something had changed. He no longer carried guilt, doubt, or hope. Just a strange serenity, like someone who finally understands they've reached the end of a road. At work, the atmosphere was even colder. Eyes avoided meeting his, smiles were faked, and the tension was palpable. He sensed something was about to happen. And it did. During a board meeting, in front of everyone, his father-in-law made a point of ridiculing him. His tone was aggressive, his words cruelly chosen. He insinuated incompetence, disloyalty, and, ultimately, fired Daniel on the spot, as if snatching a trophy from a loser. The most painful thing, however, was when he looked at Isabel, sitting a few feet away, and saw the smile on her lips. It wasn't a wide-open smile, a half-smile, almost imperceptible, but it said it all. It was the final confirmation that she was no longer on his side, that perhaps she never would be again. The blow wasn't the firing. It was her smile. Daniel stood, calmly tidied his papers, and looked at everyone present with dignity. He didn't say a word. There would be no pleas. He wouldn't beg for something that no longer made sense. He left the room like someone leaving a burning house, his clothes intact, but his heart in ashes. When he reached the elevator, he sighed deeply. There, in that moment, something inside him shattered forever. And from the silence of the elevator to the front door, he began to rebuild himself. Because sometimes, it's at the end that the true beginning begins. But what none of them knew was that the silent man who left without looking back had already prepared his next move. A move that would give each of the pieces in this game a new meaning. And something big was about to happen. Something that would change everything. The sun had already begun to sink into the horizon when Daniel parked his car in front of the building where he had lived for years. The same building where he had laughed, cried, waited, tried, and been betrayed. The tinted glass hid his serene yet watchful eyes. The new woman beside him held his hand firmly, without saying a word. She knew what this moment represented. She knew it wasn't about revenge, but about closure. It was about looking into the eyes of the one who tried to destroy her soul and showing her that she had not only survived, she had flourished. He asked her to wait there and walked down unhurriedly, with firm steps. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit, nor was he arrogant. He simply carried with him the weight of a resolved past and the lightness of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Hours earlier, he had made his final decision. After weeks of silence, far from any news, social media, or contact, a proposal thrust him into the city's spotlight. He had become a majority shareholder in a sustainable technology network that, in a matter of months, exploded in value and visibility. It wasn't luck. It was work. It was sleepless nights, days of silently swallowing sorrows, transforming pain into strategy, pushing his heart aside to listen to his mind. Success came as a consequence, not an obsession. And now, he would be the main interviewee on one of the most watched programs in the country, broadcast in prime time. That afternoon, he called his ex-father-in-law's number. The voice answered with surprise. He said few words. He asked for Isabel. He asked for the television to be turned on. And he hung up. His heart at peace. In the apartment's living room, Isabel stared at the screen. She was sitting on the sofa next to her father, remote control in hand, and an uncomfortable silence hung between them. The image appeared, and Daniel's name was prominently displayed, with the title, "From Public Dismissal to the Top, Meet the Man Behind the Sustainable Revolution." The studio was full, the presenter was smiling, and the audience was applauding enthusiastically. But Isabel couldn't hear a thing. Her heart was pounding, erratically, as if each beat were a punch to her conscience. The man she had scorned, the love she had treated as inferior, was now revered. Not out of charity, not out of appearance. Out of merit. And that hurt more than she expected. The interview continued, and Daniel responded calmly, with a maturity Isabel no longer recognized. He spoke of the importance of not giving up on yourself, even when everything seems to be against you. He spoke of how scars are part of the journey and how some losses are, in fact, liberations. The audience listened in silence, absorbed by his firm presence and sincerity. But it was at the end, when the host asked about his turning point, that Isabel's eyes began to water. Daniel didn't name names, didn't share details of the betrayal, but said something that went straight to her heart. He said he had loved someone deeply, that he had given everything, that he believed, even when he no longer received the same in return. He said the laughter of the one he loved was the last thing he heard before deciding never to return. And that, in that moment, he didn't just lose his job. He lost his footing. But it was in that abyss that he found himself. Isabel felt her face burn. She tried to hide it, but tears streamed down her face. Her father glanced at her but said nothing. He was also shocked. They both were. The silence between them was now a minefield. When the program ended, she remained there, paralyzed. She spent hours in that position, reliving all the moments she ignored, all the times she chose contempt over dialogue, distance over reconnection. She remembered the dinners she refused, the messages she didn't reply to, the lies she told. She remembered how superior she felt, how she believed Daniel wasn't enough. And now, in front of the entire country, she saw the man she dismissed receiving a standing ovation. Not for what he had, but for who he was. The next day, she summoned the courage and called. Daniel's voice answered calmly. She tried to sound confident, but failed. She said she wanted to see him, that she needed to talk. He was silent for a few seconds. He said he'd stop by later. Her voice trembled, but she agreed. She spent the afternoon tidying the house, as if waiting for something she no longer believed would come. And it came. That evening, Daniel went up to the apartment. When the door opened, Isabel felt the air drain from her. He was different. Not just in appearance, more confident, calmer, but in essence. There was something in his gaze she hadn't recognized. It was peace. And it completely disarmed her. She tried to start the conversation. She said she hadn't expected things to turn out this way. That she'd made a mistake. That she'd lost herself. That perhaps she'd never known how to handle such a real love. He listened in silence. He let her speak. And when she finished, he approached her, without anger, without arrogance. He said he forgave her. That he understood her insecurities, her fears, her choices. But he couldn't go back. Not out of pride, but because there was nothing left to rebuild. He said that loving someone who doesn't choose you hurts too much, and that he'd already found someone who chose him every day. Isabel tried to hold back her tears, but couldn't. She said she still loved him, that she was willing to start over. He held her hand for a moment, looked into her eyes, and, in a low voice, said she didn't love him, she loved what he'd become. And that the man she left, the one who waited for her with flowers and patience, was the one she never truly wanted. And that was why he wouldn't come back. She fell to her knees on the floor, overcome by a pain she couldn't explain. It wasn't the end of a relationship. It was the end of an illusion. She'd lost someone who loved her completely. And now she knew she'd never find that person again. She could have others. She could rebuild her life. But that love, that calm affection, that silence filled with presence, that was gone. And it would never return. When she looked up, Daniel was already leaving. And then, in the back of the room, she saw the TV screen flashing with a replay of the interview. She heard her own voice in her memory, mocking him, laughing, ignoring him. And everything inside her shattered. But what she didn't know yet, was that the real secret behind all that transformation was yet to be revealed. Something that would change not only her perception of Daniel, but everything she thought she knew about that ending. Something he kept hidden until the very last moment. Something that would explain why he left so calmly, and never returned. The rain was falling lightly that night when Daniel decided to go for a walk alone. The city continued to throb with its indifferent noises, but inside him, everything was silent, the kind of silence that comes after a long storm, the kind that doesn't hurt, just exists. The encounter with Isabel had been definitive. Not because of the pain it brought, but because it confirmed that sometimes, love isn't enough. He wandered aimlessly through the quiet streets of a neighborhood he hadn't frequented in years, as if searching for a last vestige of himself in the past. He stopped in front of a small corner bookstore, one of those that still retained its yellow lights and the smell of aged paper, and entered as if seeking shelter from the rain, but found something more. At the back of the bookstore, sitting with a cup of tea in her hands, was Laura. She saw him before he noticed her, and smiled with that sweet look that so often disarmed him. Daniel approached unhurriedly. He sat across from her without saying anything. He didn't need to. She offered him the tea, and he accepted. Their silent reunion carried a rare complicity. She didn't ask about Isabel, the interview, or the past. She simply looked him in the eyes, as if to say, "I'm here." And there, in that simple exchange, Daniel knew he had made the right choice. The pain Isabel had caused no longer defined who he was. And Laura wasn't trying to heal him, she was simply there for him. In the following days, Daniel began visiting the bookstore more frequently. Laura, who curated the space, engaged him in conversations about art, literature, and the invisible weight of words no one speaks. She wasn't loud, she didn't try to please. She was whole. Sincere. She looked at him as if she saw his flaws and yet didn't demand more than he could give. Over time, the two began to share more than books and coffee. Aimless walks, afternoons of comfortable silence, and, finally, nights under the same roof, where love didn't need to be explained, just felt. And it was on one of these late afternoons, while Laura was organizing old books on a makeshift shelf in their apartment, that Daniel decided to tell her what he'd kept secret until then. He took a deep breath. He sat down on the sofa and called out to her. Laura approached slowly, noticing the subtle change in his tone. She sat beside him and held his hand. Daniel began by explaining that his sudden success hadn't been solely the result of effort and strategy. He had, indeed, dedicated himself with everything he had, but the spark, the turning point, came from a silent gesture he'd made months ago, still in the final days of his marriage to Isabel. A gesture that, at the time, was more of an outburst than a plan. He'd written a letter, a single letter, and sent it, anonymously, to a foundation that promoted technology-based social projects. In it, he recounted ideas he'd developed for years but never had the courage to share. Laura listened silently, her eyes fixed on his, sensing that this went beyond a simple story. The letter reached the right hands. It was read by someone who, unaware of the author's identity, saw in it not just a proposal, but a worldview. Impressed, the foundation launched an internal call to find the person responsible. And when they finally reached Daniel, he had already been fired, having lost everything, including his faith in himself. The invitation came as a breath of fresh air. He accepted, but on one condition, that no one would know who he was, at least for a while. He wanted his ideas to be evaluated on merit, not curiosity. This was the secret he kept throughout the early days of his success. A secret that wasn't a sham, but a form of protection. Laura listened attentively, and in the end, she simply said, "You didn't hide, you protected yourself. And now, you're ready to be seen." Meanwhile, Elizabeth struggled to cope with the weight of her choices. The days dragged by in silence in the apartment, which now seemed too vast for her solitude. Daniel's absence filled every corner like a phantom presence. What hurt her most wasn't his success, his new love, or even the forgiveness he offered without hesitation. What hurt was the fact that there was no going back. She knew the love was gone, and that the time she had to save it had been wasted on pride and vanity. She began to distance herself from her old friends, to refuse invitations, to withdraw into herself. When she ran into someone she knew from her marriage, she noticed a mixture of pity and judgment in their eyes. And it consumed her insides. He began visiting places she had frequented with Daniel, as if hoping to find there a trace of what she had lost. But everything had changed. Including her. It was on one of those lonely afternoons that she decided to write. For the first time, she sat down before a blank sheet of paper and tried to express everything she felt. She wrote about the fear she'd had of not being enough, about her constant need for approval, about how she'd confused security with power. She wrote about Daniel, about how he was the only one who truly saw her, and how she hadn't known how to appreciate that. She wrote with tears, with anger at herself, with a pain she finally didn't try to hide. When she finished, she couldn't bring herself to send it. She folded the letter and put it in a book, as if that way she could at least record it for herself. She didn't expect forgiveness. He knew he'd already received it. What she didn't know was how to forgive herself. Meanwhile, Daniel and Laura continued building something new. There was no rush. There were no grandiose plans. There was presence. He began speaking at universities, mentoring young entrepreneurs, and using his story as an example that dignity is not a speech, but a way of being. At one of these talks, a young woman asked him what he would do if he could go back in time. The audience fell silent. Daniel smiled slightly, thought for a moment, and replied, "Would have chosen myself before." The phrase reverberated through the room like a silent scream, and many understood that it wasn't motivational advice. It was an invitation to deep reflection on self-love and limits. Time passed. One afternoon, Isabel decided to visit the bookstore where Daniel had been seen a few times. She didn't know what she expected to find, perhaps a trace, a memory, anything. She entered slowly, and Laura was at the counter. The two exchanged glances. Laura didn't smile or stand. She simply stood there, with the same serenity that so enchanted Daniel. Isabel approached and asked if he'd ever come around. Laura nodded. Isabel tried to maintain her composure, but there was a weariness in her eyes, a regret that had faded. She said she wanted to deliver something. She took the letter she'd written from her pocket and left it on the counter. She said she didn't want to cause trouble or ask for anything. She simply wanted him to know. Laura didn't respond. She simply accepted. Isabel left without looking back. And, in that departure, she left not only the letter, but a part of herself. Daniel read the letter days later. He was at home with Laura, sitting on the couch, when she handed him the envelope. He read it calmly, in silence. When he finished, he looked out the window and remained quiet for a few minutes. Laura asked if he was okay. He said yes. He said it hurt, of course, but at the same time, he felt profound gratitude. Because understanding another person's pain doesn't change the past, but it frees the future. He took the letter, folded it again, and put it inside an old book on the shelf. After that, he didn't speak of it again. It was a closed cycle. That night, as they lay down, Laura held his hand and said softly, "Thank you for not giving up on love." Daniel smiled and replied that, in fact, she was the one who taught him that love doesn't have to be a war. They didn't need to say anything else. They fell asleep in each other's arms, with the serenity of those who finally understand that true love doesn't require effort to prove, it simply exists, and endures. And in that shared silence, they knew they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Time followed its natural course, indifferent to the scars left on hearts, but within each of those involved, something had profoundly changed. Daniel, even at peace, was not euphoric. The public glory he had achieved did not distance him from his silent essence, quite the opposite, it made him more restrained, more aware of the price of each achievement. He had learned that not every happy ending comes from justice or reward, but from balance. His victory was not limited to interviews, contracts, or applause. His greatest achievement was having reclaimed his identity, having found a place where love didn't require struggle, where he didn't need to mold himself to be accepted. And it was precisely this awareness that kept him from any feeling of revenge. There was no room for vanity. He had seen firsthand what pride destroys. Now, his greatest challenge was keeping intact the heart that had been crushed so many times. With Laura, the days became gentle, but never banal. Between them, there was a silent language that dispensed with promises. Every gesture was genuine, and even moments of uncertainty were shared with comforting honesty. Daniel, however, carried within himself a dilemma that gradually became inescapable: what to do with the pain of others, when our own has already passed. He saw it in Laura's eyes whenever something about Isabel came up, not out of jealousy, but out of compassion. It was as if she understood the gravity of everything that had happened, and even though she wasn't guilty of anything, she carried the awareness of being beside someone whose previous history still left traces. Laura never asked for explanations, but Daniel knew her silence was an invitation to reflect. And he thought. He wondered if there was still something to be done to end, once and for all, a cycle that stubbornly dragged on through the cracks of the present. Elizabeth, for her part, lived in a near-suspended state of existence. Life went on, as it does for everyone, but nothing seemed to have color anymore. The apartment, once proudly decorated, now felt like a space of harsh memories. The clothes he wore confidently felt like ill-fitting disguises. The social gatherings that once excited her now exhausted her. There was no longer any charm in routine, no comfort in solitude. It was as if everything that had once defined her had been undone by the absence of something she only recognized when she lost it. She tried to rebuild her life, meet new people, regain her independence, but everything seemed too small, too fragile, too superficial. The letter she wrote had been her last attempt to make sense of the pain she carried, and when she saw that Daniel had read it but never responded, she understood the wordless message. It hit her harder than any scream could. Because now, all that remained was an irreversible silence. One night, she decided to visit the house where she had grown up, where so many Sunday lunches had been spent with well-rehearsed appearances and phrases. Her father greeted her with the same rigid tone as always, as if emotions had to be managed like contracts. During dinner, the subject of Daniel came up with cutting ease. Her father commented on the growth of his company, the prestige he had achieved, as if to shield himself from the guilt by saying he always knew he had potential. Isabel listened silently, but in the end, she said only one thing: "You humiliated him in front of everyone, and I let you." Her father looked at her in surprise, but before she could respond, she got up and left, leaving in the air the pain she had never dared to name. That night, Isabel didn't return home. She went to a hotel, where she spent hours staring at the ceiling, trying to understand at what exact moment she had become someone who had caused so much damage to someone she had only tried to love. Daniel, upon learning from others that Isabel had left her job and that her presence at events was becoming increasingly rare, felt a restlessness he couldn't explain. It wasn't pity. It was a sense of pending closure, as if there was still something there that needed to be said, not to reopen wounds, but to close them once and for all. He talked to Laura, explaining his feelings. She didn't hesitate. She said she understood, that she trusted him. She didn't ask what he would say, nor what he hoped to find. She simply asked that, whatever the outcome, he return with a clean heart. He promised he would. And in that promise there was truth. He arranged to meet Isabel at a discreet café, with no crowd, no expectations. She arrived punctually, as if the time she hadn't given him before was now sacred. They sat across from each other. There was no smile, no tension. Just a silent respect between two people who, somehow, still understood each other, even though they'd lost so much. Daniel began by saying he'd read the letter. He said he felt every word, that he recognized the pain and sincerity, but that it was no longer possible to go back. He'd learned that not all feelings need to be lived forever. Some exist to transform us, and then must leave. Isabel listened with teary eyes. She said she didn't want him back, that she wasn't there for that. She was there because she wanted to say, for the first time clearly, that she knew she'd failed him, that she'd ridiculed him when he needed support most, and that now she was haunted by the certainty that she'd lost him in the most stupid way possible, by not knowing how to love someone good. Daniel remained silent for a few seconds. Then he said he forgave her, but that forgiveness wasn't the most important thing. What really mattered was what she would do with all that. That she had a whole life ahead of her and needed to decide whether she would be defined by her mistakes or by how she chose to transform herself from them. Isabel cried, but didn't defend herself. She simply thanked her. And it was in that thank you that Daniel realized the cycle was finally over. When they said goodbye, there was no hug. Just a long, deep look, as if recognizing the value and weight of everything they'd experienced. Leaving the cafe, Daniel felt a new lightness, not because he had given Isabel anything, but because he had freed himself from a story that was no longer his. Returning home, the world seemed the same, but he knew something was different. He opened the door and found Laura in the kitchen, listening to music and chuckling to herself at a passage from a book she was reading. Seeing him, she stopped and stared at him for a few seconds. He walked over to her, hugged her from behind, and rested his face on her shoulder. They didn't need to say anything. In that gesture, everything was said. It wasn't about replacing anyone, nor about erasing the past. It was about moving forward with dignity, with conscious choices, with a love that doesn't demand, but embraces. In another corner of the city, Elizabeth returned home. She opened the windows, like someone needing a breath of fresh air after years of breathing the same silence. She sat on the sofa and, for the first time in a long time, smiled. Not because she was happy, but because she understood she was alive. And living, even with regret, was still a possible choice. She ran her fingers through the books on the shelf, finding the one where she had kept the original letter. She took the envelope, tore it into small pieces, and threw it away. Not because she wanted to erase the past, but because she finally felt it no longer defined her. Now, everything depended on her. And maybe, just maybe, there was still time to rebuild herself. Life offered no guarantees. Daniel knew this better than anyone. But now, walking beside Laura, amid smiles and simple plans, he realized he no longer needed promises. What he had was enough. And what he had was love. Not a movie love, full of grandiose scenes, but a real love, built on truth, respect, and presence. And that, he knew, was more than anything he had ever dreamed of. The days began to feel lighter for Daniel after that last encounter with Isabel. It wasn't a lightness made of euphoria, but of a deep, mature peace, difficult to achieve for someone who has loved so much and been broken by the same love. He returned home that night as if returning not only to a physical home, but to himself. The soft light of the next morning gently invaded the apartment, and the sound of the kettle on the stove filled the room with an intimacy he, for a long time, thought he would never experience again. Laura watched him from across the kitchen, her face still slightly swollen from sleep, her hair tied up haphazardly, and a look that, even in silence, said everything. There was something in that everyday simplicity that became sacred after living so long under the weight of judgment and doubt. He approached, wrapped his arms around her, and stayed there, simply feeling the warmth of her body pressed against his, without the need for a word. That weekend, they decided to travel to a small, secluded place where no one knew them. Laura suggested a wooden cabin near a tranquil lake, surrounded by ancient trees and trails that led to hidden clearings. It was the kind of retreat that required no cell phone signal or internet, just the complete presence of whoever was there. And it was in this setting that Daniel, for the first time in a long time, allowed himself to disconnect from everything. They walked side by side through tall trees, the sound of birds serving as a soundtrack to a rare piece. Laura, with the old camera hanging around her neck, recorded not the landscapes, but the moments between them, the way he adjusted his sleeve, the way he scanned the horizon before speaking, the silences between one step and the next. He, in turn, mentally recorded her every laugh, every word spoken with that light accent, every subtle way she had of bringing light to everything she touched. One night, sitting on the cabin's porch, Daniel decided to open a chapter of his life that he'd still kept closed. It wasn't about Isabel, nor about the company, but about something that preceded all of that, something that had shaped him from an early age and that, in some way, still influenced the way he gave himself to others. He told Laura about his mother, a strong woman who had raised him and his brother alone, after being abandoned by a man who never knew the value of family. He told her how, even with little, she did everything she could to make her children feel worthy, respected, and loved. But he also revealed how he still carried the pain of watching his mother slowly fade away out of love for someone who never returned. And how, silently, he swore he would never become like that man, but, ironically, he ended up seeing himself in the opposite role, that of the one who was left behind. Laura listened to everything with moving attention, and in the end, she simply said, "Maybe that's why you know how to love so much. Because you know absence." In the days that followed, something began to shift between them, not in the sense of tension or doubt, but in depth. The relationship gained new layers. It was no longer just about refuge, but about sharing visions, futures, stories yet to be built. Returning home, they decided to rearrange some things in the apartment, not as a fresh start, but as a declaration. Old books were donated, paintings were swapped, the dining table was repositioned, as if preparing the space for more life, more sharing. Daniel allowed himself to dream of plans that would previously have seemed too risky. Not out of fear of failure, but out of fear of giving in again. Now, this fear gave way to a feeling that was not foreign to him, but that returned renewed, trust. Meanwhile, Isabel continued her life in a subtle transformation. She wasn't someone who changed overnight, but the time she spent alone allowed her to look inward with greater courage. She began therapy. In the sessions, she confronted truths she had avoided her entire life. She discovered that her need for validation stemmed from a childhood filled with comparisons, a father who demanded perfection, and a mother who measured her through silence. She realized she was seeking approval from Daniel that he never promised to give, and that the pain she caused him was also a reflection of the pain she felt within herself. For the first time, she allowed herself not to have all the answers and learned to take responsibility for her choices without destroying herself. She began studying again, enrolling in a contemporary art course, something she had always wanted to explore but never felt she could. Little by little, she rediscovered pieces of herself she thought she had lost forever. At a cultural event in the city, months later, chance brought Daniel and Isabel together for the first time since the coffee. It was a brief, unashamed moment, yet filled with meaning. They were surrounded by people, but for a few seconds, they saw each other again. Their eyes met and there was a nod, a polite but not cold gesture. Laura stood beside Daniel, smiling, with a book in her hand. Isabel, alone, watched an art installation. There was no exchange of words. There was no need. The past was there, between them, like a silent spectator. But neither seemed willing to go back in time. When the event ended, they went their separate ways. And that was what made that moment so definitive, the absence of pain. Laura and Daniel returned home that night with the feeling that something had been sealed. He hugged her tighter than usual, and she noticed. In the early hours of the morning, as they slept side by side, a light breeze blew through the window, and with it, a tranquility so profound it seemed to bless this new cycle. There were no longer shadows of the past. There was history. And history cannot be erased, it can be understood. Each had walked a path full of failures, attempts, falls, and new beginnings. But now, finally, they were where they were meant to be. The following week, Laura organized a photography exhibition featuring images she had captured over the past few years. Each photograph was accompanied by a brief caption written by Daniel, phrases that felt more like whispers from someone observing the world with healed eyes. It was a delicate, sensitive project that touched people without fanfare. On the opening day, the space was packed. Emotional guests stopped before the images and read the phrases with teary eyes. Isabel, discreetly, was one of the last to enter. She observed each photo in silence, reading each text with a lump in her throat. In one of the images, an empty chair was seen by a lake, and below it, the phrase, "Those who leave don't always return, but sometimes, those who stay learn to move on." She smiled with moist eyes, and as she left a note at the reception. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but it said, "You taught me more than you know. Thank you for showing me what true love is." The note was given to Laura, who read it and kept it between the pages of a book that Daniel had written just for her. In life, there are pains that teach us violently, but there are also encounters that heal us gently. Daniel had known both. And now, with his hands intertwined with Laura's, he walked unhurriedly, without fear, without needing to look back. Life had begun to pulse again, not as before, but in a new way. And everything that came next, he knew, would be built with both feet on the ground and his heart, finally, at peace. The following years arrived quietly, as cycles that need no announcement often do. Life followed its course with the delicacy of things that have found balance. Daniel and Laura, now living in a house surrounded by trees and stone paths, had built a daily routine without exaggeration, yet charged with meaning. Every morning they began with coffee made in silence, and every night ended with a book shared between two bodies that had learned to rest in each other. Daniel's professional success continued to grow, but now it no longer consumed him. He knew how to stop, knew how to say no, knew what mattered. He became a reference, but also increasingly invisible to the eyes of his ego. He chose to speak only at events that touched real lives, opened a foundation in his mother's name, dedicated to educational projects for young people from the outskirts, and became a silent mentor to dozens of stories that began where his own almost ended. He didn't seek recognition, he sought transformation. And he found it. Laura, in turn, published a book with her photographs and Daniel's writing. The work was nominated for important awards, but what moved her most were the anonymous letters she received from ordinary people, touched by simple yet profound images, of moments she knew how to capture between pain and light. Her art wasn't exhibitionist, it was confessional. In each photograph, there was a silence filled with emotion, and in each text, an echo of someone who survived an intimate war without needing to explode. She and Daniel no longer spoke of Isabel, not out of indifference, but because the memory of her had ceased to be a ghost and had become merely part of the past. A necessary but closed chapter. When, by chance, they saw her name in some news story, a glance between them was enough to understand there was nothing more to be said. Isabel, on the other hand, continued her journey of starting over, but without glamour. After leaving the corporate world, she decided to travel for a while. She visited small towns, places where no one knew her last name, where her story didn't precede her. She worked in cafes, taught art classes to children, and learned to listen more than she spoke. She still carried unhealed pain, but she no longer sought blame. She accepted her choices like someone learning to live with their own shadow. On one of these trips, she met a woman named Margot, the owner of a small inn, who, upon hearing her speak for the first time about her past, said something that stayed with her forever: "Daughter, there are people who only learn the value of bread after they're truly hungry. But knowing this doesn't feed you. Only those who learn to plant change." And Isabel decided to plant. He returned years later, with a new purpose. He opened a simple studio, where he offered workshops in collage, intuitive painting, and therapeutic writing. It was frequented by women who carried similar stories, of guilt, of abandonment, of irreparable mistakes. Isabel never presented herself as a guide, but as an equal. She was clear that she still made mistakes, still missed someone, still dreamed of what she had destroyed. But now she did things differently. In one of these classes, a young woman asked if she still thought about the man she lost. Isabel responded, looking out the open window, "Every day. But not with pain. With responsibility." And that was enough. Isabel's father, who had long ago distanced himself from her because he refused to accept her decisions, suddenly fell ill. He no longer held the power he once held, nor the automatic respect he bought with money. In the last months of his life, he was cared for only by hired nurses, in a large, cold apartment. Isabel visited him only a few times. The last time, he barely recognized their faces. She entered the room silently, stood for a few minutes, and before leaving, said, "I hope that one day you will understand that the world you built had no place for anyone, not even for you." And she closed the door. He died 3 days later. At the funeral, there was hardly anyone there. Daniel heard the news by chance. He received a brief message from an old contact. He read it, reflected, and decided not to attend. Not out of resentment, but because that chapter was no longer his. True closure had come when he chose silence as a response to humiliation. The peace he carried no longer needed witnesses. He chose to spend that day walking with Laura along a new, unfamiliar trail, where each step was another choice not to return. They sat on a high rock, and as they watched the sunset, he said, "We only understand we've won when we realize we no longer feel like explaining anything to anyone." Laura smiled, rested her head on his shoulder, and they stayed there until nightfall. Some time later, Daniel was invited to open an international conference on emotional ethics in business. His speech was direct, profound, and human. He spoke about silent choices, about courage without a stage, about the importance of recognizing others as a mirror that reveals both virtues and vanities. At the end, he received a standing ovation. One of the organizers, greeting him backstage, said he was a model of integrity. Daniel thanked them, but was unmoved by the compliment. He knew that true integrity is not proven on stage, but in a dark room, when no one is watching. And he had been in many such rooms. One rainy afternoon, Isabel decided to visit the exhibition of an artist she admired. Entering the main hall, she stopped in front of a black and white photograph, a dirt road, with footprints side by side. The caption read a phrase she knew well: "Love isn't about arriving together, it's about not letting the other walk alone." Her chest tightened, but she didn't cry. She just smiled, grabbed her notebook, and jotted down something that would one day become poetry. She left the hall and walked unhurriedly through the rain. There was still much to live for. And so, each found their own way forward. Daniel, with the serenity of someone who chose themselves. Laura, with the sensitivity of someone who knew how to embrace without invading. Isabel, with the honesty of someone who stopped running from herself. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a real ending. With scars, memories, and growth. With losses that never return, but teach. With loves that didn't endure, but gave way to others, steadier, calmer, more conscious. Because, in the end, true love isn't imposed, isn't hidden, and isn't negotiated. It simply exists. And if it's scorned, it leaves. And when it leaves, it doesn't return. It teaches. And it goes. If you've made it this far, tell us, what did you think of this story? Which character resonated with you the most? What choice would you have made differently? Leave a comment, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more real, profound, and moving stories like this one. Your presence here is very important. And before we close, a necessary reflection: betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships, it destroys trust, stories, families, dreams, and even the betrayer. Sometimes, you don't just lose the other person, you lose yourself. That's why we never normalize betrayal on this channel. Here, we defend love with truth, respect, and awareness. Until the next story. And remember, those who love, care, those who care don't betray.